In the 1820s, the Appalachian Mountains were a harsh and unforgiving land. Life here had nothing in common with romantic tales of conquering the wilderness. Imagine a one-room log cabin measuring just 4 by 5 meters. A family of 8 is forced to survive in this tiny, dark space. The fire in the hearth serves as the only source of heat and the only way to prepare meager meals. The air inside is constantly thick with acrid smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies. The winter cold seeps through cracks in the walls and freezes out their meager reserves of hope. The nearest neighbor is at least 10 miles away, on foot through a dense forest. If someone becomes seriously ill or is injured, a doctor must be sought 40 miles from home. The true history of these places is written in hard labor, disease, and a constant sense of hunger. The struggle for survival demanded incredible physical and psychological resilience from the settlers. Women gave birth in unsanitary conditions without any medical assistance. A third of the infants did not live to see their first birthday due to the cold and infections. Hard labor turned young mothers into old women by the time they were 35. Let's spend a full day in such a house and experience this reality. The dwelling of a typical settler family was a rough wooden box made of thick logs. The interior space, measuring 20 square meters, served as a bedroom, kitchen, and living room all at once. The floor was usually just tightly packed earth, which turned to ice in the winter. Wide gaps remained between the logs, through which the piercing mountain wind blew. The owners tried to seal these holes with a mixture of clay, dry grass, and animal manure. The open stone hearth always remained the central hub of life in this tiny house. It was never allowed to go out because it was incredibly difficult to rekindle the fire. The flames provided the only light during the long winter evenings when the sun set very early. The smoke did not always escape through the crooked chimney made of stones and clay. A significant amount of soot constantly hung in the air beneath the low wooden ceiling. The eyes of everyone in the hut were constantly watering from the acrid smoke of burning damp wood. A chronic cough was considered normal for every member of the family, young and old alike. The interior walls quickly became covered with a thick layer of black, greasy soot. This soot seeped into clothing, skin, and hair. It was practically impossible to wash off. People had to breathe this air around the clock, which slowly destroyed their lungs. Windows in such huts were extremely rare due to the high cost and fragility of glass. Instead, small openings were cut into the walls, which were covered with heavy wooden shutters. During the day, the shutters had to be opened to let in at least a little sunlight. In winter, along with the light, frosty air rushed into the room, forcing people to huddle by the fire. During heavy snowstorms, the windows were shut tight, and the family sat in semi-darkness for days on end. The furniture was extremely primitive and was made by the head of the family from whatever materials were at hand. A rough wooden table and a few benches took up a significant portion of the available space. The parents' bed stood against the wall, consisting of a wooden frame with ropes stretched across it instead of springs. The mattresses were stuffed with dry corn husks, which rustled loudly with every movement. Tools, weapons, and meager food supplies for the winter were also stored in this same room. 8 people were in constant close contact with one another every day. There was simply no personal space for either the adults or the growing children. Every action took place in full view of the entire family, depriving people of any opportunity for privacy. Noise, conversation, and the cries of infants constantly filled these 20 square meters. The psychological strain from such cramped quarters was immense, but the settlers had no choice. On long winter evenings, the whole family gathered around the hearth in search of warmth. The women mended old clothes by the dim light of the flickering flame. The men repaired tools or cleaned their guns, preparing for tomorrow's hunt. The children sat right on the earthen floor, huddling close to one another to keep from freezing. The silence was broken only by the crackling of burning logs and the howling of the icy wind outside. The smell in the hut was incredibly heavy and very distinctive. A mixture of smoke, sweat, old leather, and cooking food had permanently seeped into the wood. Washing one's entire body in winter was too cold and dangerous for those in poor health. People only occasionally wiped their faces and hands with cold water from a wooden bucket. Clothes were washed very rarely, so they constantly gave off the pungent smell of an unwashed body. Cookware was limited to a heavy cast iron pot, a large frying pan, and a few wooden bowls. Wooden spoons were carved from soft woods during long evenings. Washing the dishes amounted to simply scraping off food scraps and rinsing them with boiling water. Grease accumulated in the microscopic cracks of the wood, giving the food a rancid taste. Metal forks were considered an incredible luxury, available only to very wealthy people in the cities. Life in such a space taught incredible patience and submission to a harsh fate. Every inch of the hut was used as efficiently and rationally as possible for survival. Bundles of dried herbs, corn cobs, and pieces of salted meat were hung from the ceiling beams. Under the parents' bed were stored their few valuable possessions and a chest of spare clothing. The log cabin was a true wooden fortress, protecting the family from the harsh outside world. The night in the Appalachian cabin brought new tests of endurance. The parents slept downstairs on their wooden bed, trying to stay warm under heavy woolen blankets. The 6 children went to sleep in the attic, reached by a rough wooden staircase. The attic was a narrow, dark space beneath the steeply pitched shingled roof. There were no windows and no proper floor. Only uneven planks laid across the ceiling beams. Upstairs, the children slept huddled together on large mattresses tightly stuffed with dry straw or grass. They pressed close to one another to keep warm in the freezing night air. Some of the heat from the hearth rose upstairs, but along with it came all the acrid smoke. The children often woke up in the middle of the night from bouts of choking coughs. They had to sleep in the same clothes they had worn all day. The straw mattresses served as an ideal home for a vast number of tiny insects. Bedbugs and fleas were the children's constant neighbors, turning their sleep into a torturous struggle. The bites caused intense itching, and the scratched sores often became infected in the unsanitary conditions. Changing the mattress stuffing was extremely rare. It was usually done only once a year after the harvest. Until then, they had to endure constant discomfort and painful bites in the dark. One of the most unpleasant aspects of nightlife was the use of chamber pots. Going outside in the bitter cold or under pouring rain was too dangerous and cold. For this purpose, they used clay jugs or wooden buckets standing in the corner of the hut. By morning, the smell in the warm air of the small room became incredibly pungent and nauseating. These odors mingled with the smells of ashes and dirty clothes, creating an incredibly oppressive atmosphere. The morning always began in the dark, long before the sun rose. The temperature inside the hut dropped sharply overnight as the fire in the hearth gradually burned down to embers. Waking up and crawling out from under the warm blankets into the icy air was pure torture. The older children came down from the attic, shivering from the biting cold in the semi-darkness. The first task was to stoke the embers and throw on some dry firewood to bring the heat back into the house. Immediately after waking up, it was time to take the full chamber pots outside. This unpleasant duty was usually assigned to the older children in the family. The contents were poured into a special pit at the edge of the yard or simply behind the bushes, far from the house. The frosty morning air stung the lungs as the children ran barefoot or in thin shoes through the snow. The chamber pots had to be rinsed with cold water from a bucket and returned to their place. Then they had to fetch fresh water from the nearest stream or well. In winter, the stream often froze over, and the ice had to be broken with a heavy iron crowbar. The water was carried in heavy wooden buckets that strained the arms and splashed icy water on the legs. This water was used for drinking, cooking, and a quick morning wash. Every drop was highly valued because obtaining it required enormous physical effort. The mother of the family was the first to rise so she could prepare breakfast before the start of a hard day's work. She bustled about the hearth, making sure the flame burned evenly and strongly. Meanwhile, the men went out to the yard to feed the few domestic animals. The animals' lives were also harsh, and they had to be protected from predators and the cold. The success of the long day ahead depended on the smooth coordination of these morning tasks. Morning washing was an extremely quick and very superficial hygiene routine. Cold water was poured into a small wooden bowl to rinse the face and hands. No one had even heard of soap with pleasant scents. They used coarse, homemade lye soap. It dried out the skin severely, leaving painful microscopic cracks on it. No one wasted time on lengthy preparations, as a huge amount of hard work lay ahead. Dawn slowly painted the sky over the Appalachians in shades of grey and pale hues. It was getting a little lighter in the cabin, and the family gathered around the rough table for a meal. The prayer before the meal was a mandatory ritual, offering hope for a safe day. People asked the higher powers to protect them from disease, wild animals, and hunger. After a short prayer, the monotonous meal began, providing the energy needed for survival. The food in an Appalachian cabin was remarkably monotonous and meager. Corn grown in a small cleared field formed the basis of the diet year-round. Wheat flour was too expensive and a rare luxury for ordinary settlers. Hard corn kernels were ground into coarse grits on a hand mill for daily porridge. This porridge was cooked in water every day, making it the main source of sustenance. Making corn porridge didn't require any advanced cooking skills or expensive equipment. The women simply boiled the grits in a heavy cast-iron pot over an open fire. Very simple ingredients were needed to prepare this daily meal. The recipe went like this. Ingredients: water, cornmeal, salt pork. The settlers simply had no other ingredients, so the taste of the food remained unchanged for months. The only addition to the plain porridge was incredibly tough salted pork. In the fall, the family would slaughter 1 or 2 pigs to stock up on meat for the long winter. The meat was generously sprinkled with coarse salt and stored in wooden barrels or hung from the ceiling. Over the course of several months, the pork became so dry and hard that it was impossible to simply bite into it. Before eating, the pieces of meat were simmered for a long time to remove excess salt and make them softer. The fat rendered from the pork was carefully collected and used to fry corn tortillas. The tortillas were baked directly on a red-hot iron skillet without adding yeast or eggs. They turned out dense, heavy, and often burned at the edges from the intense heat of the hearth. The hot tortillas were dipped in the leftover pork fat to get at least a few extra calories. This diet helped people avoid dying of starvation, but it caused enormous harm to their health. Corn and salted meat were almost completely devoid of the vitamins necessary for the body to function normally. Vegetables from the small garden ran out long before spring arrived. Fresh fruit was unavailable, and berries picked in the summer were quickly eaten or spoiled. Due to a severe lack of vitamin C, by the end of winter, most family members began to develop scurvy. This terrible disease slowly destroyed people's bodies, robbing them of their last reserves of strength. Scurvy manifested as constant weakness, joint pain, and bleeding gums. Teeth became loose and fell out even in very young and strong people. Chewing tough, salted pork without teeth became a real daily ordeal. The skin became covered with dark spots, and even the slightest scratches became inflamed and would not heal for weeks. Scurvy could only be cured with the arrival of the first spring greens in the forest. Women tried to gather wild onions, dandelions, and young tree shoots as soon as the snow melted. They used this bitter greenery to make thin soups, which were regarded as a true natural remedy. Children often chewed on pine needles, instinctively trying to make up for the lack of vitamins in their bodies. Spring was always the hungriest and hardest time of year for the settlers. Old supplies were running out, and the new crop hadn't even been planted yet. In the summer, the diet improved slightly thanks to the vegetable garden and the bounty of the wild forest. Fresh beans, squash, wild berries, and nuts appeared, which were gathered in the surrounding area. The men sometimes brought back fresh game from hunting, such as rabbits, squirrels, or wild turkeys. Such meat was considered a true festive treat and was eaten down to the very last bone. However, summer was short, and the family was constantly thinking about how to stock up on food for the coming winter. A constant feeling of hunger or malnutrition was the norm for everyone living in the cabin. Food was seen not as a source of pleasure, but as fuel for hard physical labor. Portions were strictly rationed, and no one was allowed to take more than their allotted share. The children often went to bed with rumbling stomachs, dreaming of a slice of sweet pie from the tales of the city. Their digestion was disrupted by coarse fiber and an excess of salt, causing constant stomach aches. Water was the only drink available to the family every single day without exception. Coffee or black tea were incredibly expensive goods that were brought from far away. Sometimes the women would brew dried raspberry or mint leaves to make a warm, fragrant drink. Sugar was replaced with wild honey or maple syrup, gathered through hard labor in the spring forest. Every mug of sweet herbal tea was a rare moment of joy in a string of monotonous grey days. Life in the Appalachian Mountains meant complete isolation from civilized human society. To reach the nearest neighbor, one had to travel 10 miles along remote forest trails. This journey took several hours on foot and became deadly dangerous in bad weather. Horses were a rarity, and people relied solely on their own legs and endurance. Visitors came only a few times a year and were always a huge event. News from the outside world reached the cabin with a delay of many long months. The settlers might not know who had become the new president or what laws had been passed in the capital. Their world was reduced to the size of their own clearing, the surrounding forest, and the hard daily labor. Contact with relatives who had remained in the cities was almost completely severed after the move to the mountains. Letters took a very long time to arrive and were often lost along the way, leaving people in complete the dark. This isolation made the family extremely vulnerable to any unforeseen life-threatening disasters. If a fire broke out in the house, no one could come to the rescue with buckets of water. In the event of a serious injury while logging or hunting, a person would most often simply die from blood loss. Men understood that they bore absolute responsibility for the survival of their wives and young children. Every mistake in judging the weather or their own strength could cost the entire family their lives. The surrounding forest was not only a source of timber and game, but also a habitat of deadly threats. Huge black bears and graceful yet bloodthirsty panthers roamed the dense Appalachian wilderness. These predators were not afraid to come close to human dwellings in search of easy prey. At night, through the cracks in the log walls, one could hear the piercing cry of a mountain lion. The sound made the blood run cold and caused the children to hide, burying their heads under thick woolen blankets. Protecting the small herd of livestock from forest predators required constant vigilance. Pigs and chickens were an incredibly valuable resource. Losing them meant certain starvation in the winter. Men often slept with a loaded rifle next to their bed, so they could fire into the darkness at a moment's notice. Dogs, if the family had any, served as the first line of defense, barking loudly at the first sign of danger. A dog's life was short, as these loyal animals often perished in battles with bears or wolves. Fear of the wilderness was deeply ingrained in the mind of every inhabitant of a mountain cabin. The forest seemed dark, endless, and full of invisible eyes watching every step a person took. Children were severely punished if they wandered too far from the cleared clearing near their home to play. Getting lost in the thick undergrowth meant almost certain death from the cold or the fangs of nocturnal predators. Nature did not forgive carelessness and punished even the slightest lapse in concentration harshly. The fire in the hearth served not only to provide warmth, but also to scare away wild animals. Predators instinctively feared the smell of smoke and the bright light shining through the window shutters. If the fire happened to go out at night, the sense of security instantly vanished from people's minds. Restoring the flame became a top priority, upon which the peace of the entire family depended. The hearth was perceived as a magical shield, separating a tiny island of humanity from primal chaos. Isolation had a profound effect on the character and worldview of the growing, isolated children. For months on end, they saw no one but their parents and siblings. Their games involved imitating the hard labor of adults, such as chopping wood or hunting. They knew nothing of store-bought toys, substituting them with wooden logs or rag dolls. The children grew up incredibly withdrawn, silent, and far too serious for their age. The lack of schools meant that the children's education fell entirely on the shoulders of their exhausted parents. At best, a mother could teach them to read from the only book in the house, an old Bible. They learned to write with charcoal on flat pieces of wood, or simply with a thin stick on damp earth. Knowledge of the laws of nature and the habits of animals was valued far more highly than the ability to write letters beautifully. A child had to be able to build a fire in the rain and find edible roots in the forest. The silence of the surrounding world often weighed on the psyche more heavily than the loud noise of the city. The absence of familiar human sounds forced one to listen for every rustle behind the wooden wall. The creaking of wood under the pressure of the wind or the howl of a lone wolf in the distance were perceived with incredible acuity. People learned to understand the language of nature, predicting the weather by the behavior of birds and the shape of clouds. This forced harmony with the forest was the only reliable way to survive on the edge of the inhabited world. A woman's life in an Appalachian log cabin was filled with endless toil and physical pain. From early morning until late at night, the mother of the family knew not a single moment of true rest. She had to cook, wash, sew, spin, and care for her many children. Hard work at the hot hearth and carrying ice-cold water quickly ruined her health. By the age of 35, a woman often looked well into her 60s, with a wrinkled face and a hunched back. One of the most grueling trials in a woman's life was pregnancy and difficult childbirth. In conditions of complete isolation, it was impossible to summon a doctor even with a great deal of money. The nearest doctor was a 40-mile drive over rough terrain, making his arrival unrealistic. Women gave birth in the same cramped hut, often relying solely on their husband's help. Unsanitary conditions and a lack of clean water led to frequent childbed fevers and dangerous infections. The birth took place on a bed with a straw mattress, surrounded by older children. It was simply physically impossible to conceal this natural process in a one-room log cabin. The woman in labor had to endure excruciating pain in complete silence so as not to frighten the rest of the family. Any serious complications during childbirth most often led to the death of both mother and child. Bleeding was stopped using extremely primitive methods, such as applying clean rags or bundles of specific herbs. Infant mortality in such settlements reached a staggering 30% in the first years of life. Infants often died from colds, intestinal infections, or malnutrition during the winter months. The loss of a child was a frequent and incredibly traumatic event for every mother. Dead children were buried in small, unmarked graves right at the edge of a cleared forest clearing. Parents had no time for a long period of mourning because their living children required constant care. Dangerous diseases spread easily from one child to another in the incredibly cramped conditions. As soon as one infant fell ill with whooping cough or measles, the infection quickly swept through the entire children's loft. Mothers desperately tried to treat their children with herbal decoctions and hot compresses, but this rarely helped. A high fever was often a death sentence for a child's body weakened by meager nutrition. At night, the hut was filled with the heavy coughing and incredibly raspy breathing of the suffering infants. Those children who managed to survive very quickly became helpers in the hard work of the household. As early as 5 years old, a child was given their first regular chores around the house and in the yard. Girls diligently helped their mothers spin wool, look after their younger brothers, and clean the harvested vegetables. Boys chopped small firewood, hauled water, and learned from their fathers how to set traps for small game. Childhood ended very quickly, giving way to the harsh and merciless routine of daily survival. The woman bore the enormous responsibility of making all the clothing for a family of 8. The wool had to be sheared from the sheep, washed, combed, spun into long threads, and woven into coarse cloth. The process of making a single warm shirt took long weeks of monotonous labor by the light of a dim fire. Needles were of immense value. They were cherished and passed down from mother to daughter. The loss of a small steel needle became a true domestic disaster for the entire household. Washing clothes turned into a massive and very exhausting procedure, especially during the cold season. Water had to be carried from the stream for a long time and then heated in a heavy cauldron over an open hearth. The coarse fabric was scrubbed by hand using lye soap, which corroded the delicate skin until it bled. Heavy, wet items had to be wrung out by hand, which demanded enormous physical effort from the woman. Clothes were dried right in the hut, filling the air with dampness and the smell of wet wool. The constant fear for her children's fragile lives slowly wore down the mother's nervous system. She had to remain vigilant at all times, watching for sparks from the hearth or the approach of forest predators. The woman's sleep was always incredibly light and fitful. She would wake at the slightest rustle. Nervous breakdowns and deep depression were common but completely unspoken of in such families. Complaining of overwhelming fatigue was not the done thing, as everyone around her was working to the limit of their abilities. Despite all the hardships, it was the woman who always remained the central pillar holding the family together. Her love and selfless care transformed the rough wooden log cabin into a true human home. She taught the children moral principles and tried to preserve the remnants of civilization in the wild mountain forest. The price of this daily feat was high. She gave her youth, health, and beauty to her family. The history of the settlement of these mountains is written in the sweat and blood of these unknown but incredibly strong mothers. The surrounding wild forest was a constant source of injuries and life-threatening situations. The men spent a great deal of time cutting down trees to expand the fields and gather firewood. Felling massive, centuries-old trees with an old axe required not only strength, but also extreme caution. A trunk that fell accidentally or a heavy branch that snapped off could easily break bones or shatter a skull. A broken leg meant that the family would be completely deprived of its main breadwinner for long, hungry months. Hunting also harbored a multitude of unpredictable and deadly threats for a lone hunter. Gunpowder and lead were very expensive, so thrifty hunters tried to get as close to their prey as possible. This often led to unexpected direct encounters with wounded bears or aggressive wild boars. The animal's fangs and claws left very deep, jagged wounds that became instantly infected from exposure to dirt. Such horrific wounds had to be sutured with a regular needle and coarse thread without any medical pain relief. Minor household injuries, such as deep cuts or burns, occurred in the hut almost every day. working with very sharp tools and open flames in a confined space inevitably led to accidents. There were absolutely no antiseptics. Wounds were simply rinsed with water and bandaged with clean scraps of old cloth. Various folk remedies were often used, such as applying forest spiderwebs to stop heavy bleeding. Any small, deep cut could result in blood poisoning and a painful death within a few days. Bites from venomous forest snakes posed a tremendous danger during the warm season while working in the fields. Copperheads and dangerous rattlesnakes often hid in tall grass or among dry, rotten logs. A strong adult might survive a bite, suffering for several days with an incredibly high fever. For a small, weakened child, snake venom was often fatal, killing the child in a matter of hours. There were no anti-venoms at the time. People simply made a deep incision at the bite site, desperately trying to squeeze out the poisoned blood. Intestinal infections and harmful parasites were constant companions in the lives of settlers, due to the complete lack of sanitation. Water from the nearest stream, especially in the spring or after heavy rains, could carry very dangerous bacteria. Undercooked wild meat or simply unwashed hands led to infection with various types of dangerous worms. Small children constantly suffered from sharp stomach pains and severe weight loss due to parasites. There were no effective medicines for this scourge. People used decoctions of bitter herbs, hoping for a miracle. The harsh and incredibly long Appalachian winters brought epidemics of severe respiratory diseases. Severe pneumonia killed people very quickly, especially frail elderly people and small children. A sick person would simply burn up from a very high fever on a straw mattress under the roof of an icy attic. The cough was so wrenching and intense that sometimes ribs would break from the constant strain on the chest. Relatives could only occasionally moisten the patient's lips with cold water and pray desperately for their recovery. Smallpox was a terrible and inevitable scourge, occasionally brought in by rare travelers or passing merchants. This incredibly contagious disease spread like wildfire, striking every single inhabitant of the tiny log cabin without exception. The bodies of the unfortunate patients quickly became covered with extremely painful pustules, leaving deep, disfiguring scars for life. The mortality rate from the smallpox outbreak in these remote mountain settlements was catastrophic due to the complete lack of quarantine measures. The lucky survivors often went blind or suffered incredibly severe complications affecting their internal organs. A common toothache turned into a veritable, exhausting ordeal, lasting for weeks and months without any respite. Dentistry in the mountains was non-existent. Teeth simply rotted and decayed rapidly due to a diet lacking in vitamins. In cases of very severe and painful inflammation, a decayed tooth had to be pulled out using ordinary dirty blacksmith's pliers. This bloody procedure was performed by the head of the family himself, while the other family members held the patient down tightly as he screamed in pain. Infection of the gums following such an incredibly brutal extraction often led to an abscess and dangerous inflammation of the jaw. People's understanding of the true causes of disease in those harsh times was based on primitive superstitions. They sincerely believed in the evil eye, the mystical influence of the moon's phases, and just punishment for sins committed. Instead of any effective medical treatment, they often resorted to absurd rituals or cruelly bled the weakened patient. Nature itself ruthlessly decided who was truly worthy of life and whose body was too weak to continue the struggle. natural biological selection operated here in its most brutal, primitive, and uncompromising form. The family survived only thanks to the incredible immune systems of those who managed to survive the terrible trials of childhood. Strong and resilient people fought off colds on their feet, stubbornly continuing to perform their hard daily work. To fall ill meant becoming an incredible burden on the others, so physical weakness was carefully concealed until the very last moment. Every new year lived was sincerely perceived as a huge victory over the harsh mountain climate and one's own body. Human life was incredibly short, yet densely filled with a fierce struggle for every new breath. Hard daily labor was the main purpose and sole content of life for the inhabitants of the small one-room log cabin. The concept of 3 days off or a proper long vacation simply did not exist in this harsh reality. From early spring to late, damp autumn, all their energy went into growing a meager corn crop. Stumps were uprooted by hand using only heavy axes, iron crowbars, and the physical strength of exhausted people. The stony ground was ploughed with a heavy wooden plough, either by harnessing oxen to it or by leaning on the handles with one's own weight. Planting and tending to the vital corn crop required the mandatory participation of every member of the large family, young and old alike. Under the hot, scorching sun, people weeded the rows for long hours, shooing away swarms of pesky, blood-sucking insects. Their backs ached terribly from constantly bending over, and their palms were covered with a thick layer of very rough calluses. The future harvest had to be protected around the clock from wild birds, cunning raccoons, and hungry black bears. The family's survival during the coming cold winter months depended directly on the final amount of grain harvested in the fall. Gathering firewood every day was a grueling, never-ending process that never stopped, not even for a single day. The open hearth consumed a tremendous amount of dry wood just to maintain a modicum of warmth in the cold hut. Adult men felled thick trees, sawed them with a heavy two-handed saw, and split them into even logs. Small children constantly gathered dry fallen branches in the forest and stacked them into huge wood piles near the house. Active work with an axe warmed the body better than any fire, but quickly exhausted the muscles to the point of complete exhaustion. The making of household wooden utensils and hand tools also fell entirely on the shoulders of the head of the large family. On long and very dark winter evenings, by the light of a burning torch, he carved wooden spoons, bowls, and axe handles. Footwear was roughly sewn from the tanned hides of hunted animals, in a desperate attempt to make it as durable and completely waterproof as possible. The leather soles wore down very quickly against the mountain rocks, and the boots had to be constantly repaired and patched with thick patches. Everyday clothing was re-sewn countless times until the fabric finally turned into dirty grey rags. The hidden psychological strain of such monotonous and grueling labor was incredibly immense and destructive. Living people slowly turned into living machines, tuned only to the precise execution of basic tasks for survival. There was a catastrophic lack of free time for entertainment, reading useful books, or simply philosophical reflection. Physical fatigue accumulated over many long years, making people very sullen, silent, and incredibly stingy with open emotions. Only the simplest, most basic things brought genuine joy: hot food, dry, warm clothes, and the absence of serious illness. The harsh winter was perceived not as a peaceful time of rest, but as a very long period of severe testing of endurance. The constant, piercing cold forced people to expend a great deal of precious energy simply to maintain their body temperature. Meager food supplies were rapidly dwindling before their eyes, and each new day brought the spring season of acute hunger closer. The frozen people sat in a cramped, dark hut, trying to move as little as possible to conserve precious calories. The long, frosty nights dragged on endlessly about the family's future. The secret dreams of the inhabitants of the mountain log cabin were extremely simple and pragmatic, concerned only with improving their daily lives. They sincerely dreamed of a good, heavy iron plow, a new warm woolen cloth, or a real glass window. The long trip to the nearest large city for necessary purchases was considered a once-in-a-lifetime event. There, they openly sold absolutely incredible things: porcelain tableware, smooth metal nails, real Indian tea, and sweet sugar. These city goods seemed like true treasures from another, completely unattainable and magical fairy tale world. The attitude toward inevitable death was very philosophical and completely devoid of the modern human drama or panic. Pragmatic people understood perfectly well that their lives hung by a thin thread and could be cut short at any unexpected moment. They always prepared for death in advance, whacking together the simplest pine coffins and storing them in a dusty attic. They remembered their deceased loved ones without loud, hysterical sobs, understanding that their earthly, agonizing suffering had finally come to an end. The harsh life stubbornly continued, demanding that the living strictly fulfill their daily duties in maintaining the household. Personal pride and incredible independence were the defining traits of these rugged Appalachian settlers. They never asked anyone for help and always relied solely on the strength of their own calloused hands. Their tiny wooden cabin was their personal kingdom, securely shielded from the laws and regulations of the wider world. They had chosen this difficult path entirely of their own free will, fleeing the taxes, overcrowding, and injustice of the big cities. True freedom came at an incredibly high price, but they were sincerely willing to pay that enormous price every day of their lives. 24 hours in such a cramped log cabin would drain every ounce of strength from any modern person. We have become too accustomed to comfort, hot water, a soft, clean bed, and the absolute safety of our homes. For the hardy people of the 19th century, this brutal routine was the most ordinary and only reality available to them. They stubbornly survived despite the cold, hunger, deadly diseases, and isolation in the remote, dark forests of America. Their incredible, phenomenal endurance laid a solid foundation for future generations who eventually conquered this continent. Immersing oneself in the daily reality of an Appalachian family quickly shatters all the beautiful, romantic stereotypes about the past. Life in the wilderness was not an idyllic fairy tale. It was always a brutal and uncompromising struggle. The tiny one-room log cabin was both an incredibly sturdy fortress and a cramped wooden prison for 8 people. The open hearth provided vital warmth, but slowly killed its inhabitants with acrid smoke and constant black soot. A diet of stale corn and tough pork kept their hearts beating, but mercilessly destroyed their teeth and bones. Every day lived under such unbearable conditions can safely and confidently be called a true feat of human will. People silently endured unbearable physical pain, buried their small children, and stubbornly continued to work hard. They knew absolutely nothing of antibiotics, hot showers, soft spring mattresses, or bright, warm electric light. Their entire short lives consisted of daily struggles against the forces of nature and their own human physical weaknesses. It was this endless, harsh struggle that shaped the unique and very tough character of these true American pioneers. Sensory history allows us not just to read dry historical dates, but to truly get a feel for that era. We can easily sense the smell of wet wool, the taste of plain corn porridge, and the cold of a packed earthen floor. Understanding all these details makes us look at our familiar modern comforts in a completely different light. Real history consists not only of great battles led by generals, but also of billions of quiet, everyday feats by ordinary people. They simply wanted to live desperately, and for that single purpose, they were ready to endure absolutely anything.